Ladies and gentlemen, Subnautica 2 has officially released. I know damn well I'm going to put a ton of hours on this game, so I figured might as well record it and read some Reddit stories because I enjoy stories and I love Subnautica even more. So, without further ado, let's get into our first story. This first story comes from r/funny stories titled Throwing My Steak Out a Window. So, this one should be interesting. Last night, my wife's boss from her brand new job invited us over for dinner. On the drive over, my wife reiterated many times to me just how important it was to make a good impression. I scoffed and arrogantly informed my silly wife that I always make good impressions. My wife's boss is a single lady in her 50s, so it was just the three of us. We chit-chatted over drinks and salads and seemed to really be hitting it off. She laughed at my well-timed, perfectly appropriate jokes, and my wife seemed pleased. Soon, she brought out the main course, a nice big juicy steak for each of us. As I began to cut into my steak, I was discouraged to discover how undercooked this steak was. Now, I've had my fair share of rare steak. I prefer medium, but I can handle rare. This was several minutes on a hot grill short of rare. I probably could have resurrected the cow if I had tried. Instead, I sat there, fidgeting with my knife and fork, worrying about how I was going to get away with not eating the steak. Claim veganism? No, I'd already feigned great enthusiasm upon seeing the steak. Just then, our hostess excused herself to the kitchen to take care of some dessert preparations. As I looked across the fancy dining room table at the open window of this third-story apartment, a cartoon light bulb appeared over my head. I knew I had to be decisive, realizing that she could return at any moment. I committed, I grabbed the steak with my hand, gently shook off the juice, and executed a perfect throw right through the center of the open window. Here's the big FU. The window wasn't open. It was the cleanest fricking window you've ever seen in your life. That is, until my mostly raw slab of steak slammed up against it and slowly slid down, leaving a trail of bloody juice in its wake. My wife, whose steak was a nice medium rare and was unaware of my predicament, turned jaw-dropped and stared at me like I was an alien from another planet. This look then slowly morphed into a "there is no place on this planet you can ever hide from me" expression of demonic anger. My wife's boss heard the thud of steak on window impact and came quickly. She took in the scene, the steak sitting on the windowsill, the blood trail, my empty plate, and then gave me an inquisitive, puzzled look. I just didn't know what to say. It felt like a minute of silence, but was probably 3 or 4 seconds. Finally, the best I could manage was, I'm so sorry, I am such a klutz. I don't know. I was just cutting it and it slipped. Just ask my wife. I really am a klutz. Right, honey? There was no help coming from that direction. I will clean this up. I can't believe this. I'm so sorry. Both women continued to stare at me like I had escaped from the loony bin. As I smeared the blood around the window with my cloth napkin, dusted off the steak, and continued to mutter my incoherent explanation, I knew no one was buying the story. I knew what I had to do. I sheepishly returned to my seat and proceeded to eat every bite of that disgusting, cold, chewy, bloody, raw steak. I remained pretty quiet the rest of the evening. My wife's only 2 words to me since the incident are, "I'm fine." Since the story was posted, there has been an update. Good news, boss's name, and I just had a good laugh over how much of an idiot you are. I hope you know you will never live this down. Love you, moron. There was an update on the story. Good news, boss's name and I just had a good laugh over how much of an idiot you are. I hope you know you will never live this down. Love you, moron. I'm glad that everything worked out, because that's for sure an interesting one. You probably could have gotten away with saying you haven't had steak in a really long time and then just like showing them the steak, being like, hey, it's been a while. Is the steak supposed to be this color? Like, is it supposed to be darker or something like that? But it just can't. It is on the spot, so it's harder to think of stuff like that. But I can just imagine like the look on their faces. That must have been such an awkward situation. This next story, I've just been looking a little bit on Reddit, and I found it, and I thought it looks interesting. I haven't read the whole thing, so I'm going to start, and we'll see how it goes. But this one comes from r/scary stories. I was traveling alone from New York to North Carolina to attend my grandfather's funeral. It was right around 11 p.m. when I pulled my car off Interstate 95 in Virginia. The rain was coming down so hard that the windshield wipers couldn't even keep up. My GPS had completely stopped working because of the terrible signal in this dark rural area. The dim glow from the dashboard was the only thing lighting up my face, and that low fuel light just kept staring at me with its annoying orange color. I had no choice but to look for a gas station or a small motel to spend the night. After a few minutes of driving blindly through the thick pine trees, a fading neon sign caught my eye. It was flickering in a green light displaying Pine Valley Motel vacancy. I immediately turned down the narrow, muddy driveway. The motel was incredibly old, built in that 1970s cabin-style layout. There was only one working light inside the front office. I parked the car and ran through the pouring rain when I pushed the office door open. A tiny brass bell chimed overhead. The smell was strange, a mix of dampness, mold, and some cheap chemical cleaner trying to mask the scent of something else. Behind the worn-out wooden counter sat an old man with incredibly thick glasses, making his eyes look huge and completely unnatural. He was wearing a dirty flannel shirt, and he didn't even look up from his old magazine until a few long seconds had passed. I asked him for a room for the night. He looked at me very slowly, then gave me a hollow smile, showing yellow, decaying teeth. He didn't speak. He just reached down, grabbed a heavy metal key with the number 14 on it, and placed it on the counter. He wanted $20 in cash, so I paid him. He pointed his hand toward the dark path outside and said in a dry, raspy voice, "Last cabin on the left. Don't open the door for anyone after midnight." I figured it was just a stupid joke from an old guy living in isolation, so I took the key and walked out. I drove the car down to cabin number 14. It was completely isolated from the rest, surrounded by trees on 3 sides. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was freezing. It had a double bed, an old TV with a massive screen, and a single window facing the dark woods in the back. I tried to turn on the heater, but the unit just let out a loud rattling sound and blew out cold, dusty air. I decided to just lay down with my clothes on under the heavy blankets, hoping to fall asleep quickly. It was getting close to midnight when I started hearing strange noises. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of footsteps, very light and very slow, walking around the cabin. The footsteps were sinking into the mud, moving with a steady rhythm. I felt tense, but I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, like a raccoon or a deer. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right at the back wall of the cabin, directly behind the headboard of my bed. I held my breath, then I heard a faint scratching sound on the wood outside. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingernails very slowly across the wall. I got up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window. I looked through the rain-staked glass, but couldn't see anything, just total darkness and trees moving with the wind. I let out a sigh and turned around to go back to bed. Right at that exact moment, the old phone on the nightstand let out a loud, piercing ring. The sound was so sharp it made my heart jump. I stared at the phone in shock because motels like this rarely have working lines. I walked over and picked up the receiver with a hesitant hand. No one spoke. All I could hear was heavy, rapid breathing and the faint sound of rain in the background. I said, "Hello? Who is this?" There was no answer, just the breathing got heavier. Then I heard a very familiar sound coming through the receiver. It was that sharp chime of that tiny brass bell from the front office, followed by the old man's voice screaming in pure terror, "It's not me. He is inside with you." And before I could even process the sentence, the power cut out completely. The room plunged into total darkness. Right then, I heard the click of the bathroom lock slowly opening from the inside. I sat there on the edge of the bed, completely paralyzed by fear. The darkness was so thick I couldn't even see my own hand. The moldy smell in the room suddenly grew tense, changing into a stench of rotten meat. I could hear it clearly, the wooden bathroom door moving millimeter by millimeter. My breath was shallow, and I fought to stay absolutely silent. I remembered my cell phone was in my coat pocket, hanging near the front door. I started to move very slowly, crawling on my knees across the bed, and then onto the cold, hardwood floor. Every single floorboard I pressed on made a tiny creak, cutting through the dead silence. I reached the coat and successfully pulled out the phone. I lit up the screen, keeping the brightness at the lowest setting so I wouldn't give away my position. I quickly pointed the phone's flashlight toward the bathroom. The door was wide open. The bathroom was empty, but the floor was covered in fresh, wet mud and a trail of large, bare footprints heading directly toward the small closet in the corner of the room. My hand began to shake violently. I swept the light over to the closet. The closet door was cracked open by a few inches. Through that tiny gap, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a wide, unblinking human eye staring right back at me. It didn't blink. It was surrounded by incredibly pale skin caked in dirt. I let out a muffled gasp and stumbled backwards, smashing into the wooden table. The phone slipped from my hand, falling face up on the floor and casting its light onto the ceiling. In that split second, I heard a violent burst of movement from inside the closet. Whatever was in there came rushing out in a bizarre, unnatural way, like a scrambling animal. I didn't wait to see it. I lunged for the front door, frantically fumbling with the locks, and threw myself out into the pouring rain. I ran straight for my car, never looking back. I scrambled inside and slammed the door, locking it instantly. My hands were shaking so bad I missed the ignition twice. When the engine finally roared to life, I flipped the high beams on. What I saw in the headlights made me slam on the brakes. The old man, the motel owner, was lying flat on the muddy driveway, right in front of my car. He was swimming in a pool of dark blood, his huge eyes staring blankly into nothingness. His flannel shirt was completely torn to shreds. Before I could even process the horror, I felt a violent shudder rock the entire car like something massive had just jumped off the cabin roof and landed dead center on my trunk. I looked up at the rearview mirror and saw a face pressed flat against the back glass. It was a deformed, hairless face with a massive smile stretching from ear to ear in his hand. He was holding the old, corded phone from my room, the wires torn and dangling. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal with everything I had. The tires spun wildly in the mud for a few terrifying seconds before gaining traction, and the car launched forward, swerving right past the old man's body. The thing on the roof rolled backwards from the sudden jolt, but I could hear its claws scratching deeply into the metal roof, making a sickening scraping sound. I drove like a lunatic down that narrow, pitch-black driveway until I finally burst onto the empty rural road. I was doing over 80 miles an hour through the fog and rain, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for any movement. After about 10 agonizing minutes of driving, the lights on the Interstate 95 finally appeared in the distance. I felt a massive wave of relief when I saw a large, fully lit Love's truck stop ahead, surrounded by big semi-trucks. I swung into the parking lot and slammed to a halt right in front of the main store. I got out, gasping for air, and ran inside. The young man behind the counter looked at me with horror because of my appearance. I was drenched in mud, pale as a ghost, and shaking uncontrollably. I told him to call the police immediately, explaining that there was a murder at the motel down the road. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I sat in the back of the cruiser, still trembling, and told the investigators every single detail. The footsteps, the phone call, the eye in the closet, the old man's body, and the thing that jumped onto my car. The investigator listened with a grim, skeptical look on his face. They dispatched 2 units to the motel to check it out. I stayed at the gas station for over 2 hours, watched over by another officer. Right around dawn, the investigator came back with a deeply disturbed, confused look on his face. He sat down across from me and said in a low voice, "We went out to the location you described, son. The Pine Valley Motel has been completely abandoned and boarded up since 1994 after a fire destroyed the main office and killed the old owner inside." My head started spinning and I yelled at him, "That's impossible. He gave me the key. His body is out there in the mud. Go look for the body." The investigator just looked at me coldly and replied, "We searched the whole place. There are no bodies. The cabin are completely overgrown with weeds and are decaying." He continued, "But there was one thing we found that we can't explain." I asked in a trembling voice, "What?" He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the heavy metal key with the number 14. "We found this key lying in the thick dust inside the last cabin, covered in your fresh fingerprints, but that's not all." The investigator walked me to the back of my car and shone his flashlight on the roof and trunk. On the metal of the roof, there were deep, long gouges from 5 human-like fingers, with sharp claws carved deep into the paint. Right in the middle of the back window, there was a perfect clear imprint of a human face, smudged against the glass, along with a thick, dark residue that the heavy rain hadn't completely washed away. It's been 3 years since that night. I left Virginia and never went back, selling that car the very next day. The police eventually closed the case, writing it off as local vagrants messing around. They never believed my story about the motel, but the horror never really stopped for me. To this day, whenever it rains at night and I'm lying in my bed in my new apartment in Chicago, my cell phone will start vibrating from an unknown number, and when I finally pick it up, driven by pure anxiety, I don't hear a voice. Instead, I just hear heavy, rapid breathing and the faint chime of a tiny brass bell ringing, somewhere in the background, followed by a slow, faint scratching sound, starting to move along the wall right behind the headboard of my bed. Okay, we did a little bit of a creepier one. This one obviously isn't real, but I definitely got some goosebumps reading this one since I am not a huge fan of horror. Therefore, I think it's only right that we move on to a happier and more wholesome story. I would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts in the comments, what stories you like. If you like the creepier ones, I'll continue with those. I'd love to hear some suggestions, but with that being said, let's continue. This one comes from r/wholesome stories. I made my dad cry on Christmas Eve. The title sounds bad, I know, but we'll get to that in a moment. If I could, I'd like to give you some backstory. My dad was, and still is, an avid music listener, and he loves to collect CDs and records of his favorite bands, and before my dad met my mom, he was with his ex-wife. She was an alcoholic and abusive to my dad. She is still an alcoholic and still abusive to this day. So one day he catches her in bed with his best friend and they divorce. She left him with only the clothes on his back simply because he wanted to get out of that marriage as soon as possible. So fast forward a bit, my parents meet and they have me and my brother. He told me about his record collection a few years back when I started collecting records, and he said that his ex had thrown his record collection out. Me, my mom, and my two sisters don't believe that. Last year I had gotten into Levi and I love sharing what music I'm listening to with my dad, so imagine my surprise when he tells me he had 5 vinyl as part of his collection. So, last December, me, my siblings, and parents decided we wanted to do Secret Santa. We agreed on a £10 budget and drew names. I got my dad, and I knew what I would get him as soon as I pulled his name. So I went on eBay and found Levi Sifri, It Must Be Love on 5, single for £5, and immediately bought it. Come Christmas Eve, me and my parents went out drinking with their friends, and we had a good time. When we got back home and decided to open the Secret Santa gifts, I want you to keep in mind I had never seen my dad cry beforehand, so I was extremely surprised when he opened my gift and immediately started sobbing. What I hadn't known was that the vinyl I had gotten him was the first ever vinyl he had in his collection, given to him by his mom, and he told me that he could never place it properly due to sentimental value until now. We listened to the entire thing together right then, and I had to hug him multiple times because he was practically inconsolable. I think that is the best gift I have ever given someone. I also pitched together with my brothers to buy him a 70-pound bottle of whiskey, but sentimental value costs more than monetary value. Oh, that's a nice story. It's always such an amazing feeling when you do something like that for someone, and it's even more special when it's someone like your dad. Unfortunately, that's all I've got for you guys today, so comment below what stories you like best, or if there's a specific genre you'd be interested in. Hopefully you guys also enjoyed the Subnautica gameplay. Let me know if there's any other games you guys would like to see, but other than that, thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button for me if you like this sort of content, and I'll see you in the next one.